talking in the general conference camp meeting, which is interesting because trying to work out the time zones and when I've got to be online, it's been really hard because it's in 3 different time zones and then you convert to Australian time, make sure it's Sydney Australian time so you're online at the right time. But it's good to see a general conference camp meeting running, which is bringing the whole world together. So yeah, if you want to Google that and go online, some great speakers lined up happening right now and over the next couple of days with the general conference camp meeting. Of course, I've been involved in Grey Nomads. I saw some of you there. Where are our Grey Nomad people? Yes. I had fun. I was there for both weekends. I nicked up on the Wednesday in the middle and loaded up a truck of big camp stuff and brought back as well. And that's sitting in our garage back at the office, ready to unpack. Then I drove down to Albury and I spent the week at Border Christian College this week presenting Week of Worship to the students there. What a great school that is down there at Border Christian College. And then came back and spent time with a family friend last night who passed away at 2:30 a.m. this morning. And my wife's gone down there to be with the family today. For those that may know, Adrian Smith, not your Adrian Smith, a friend of the family's Adrian Smith from Sydney, ran an electronics business. He's been a friend of my wife's family for many, many, many years and a really close mentor as well. So, yeah, please pray for the Smith family down in Sydney as they grieve their loved one. Today, when Janelle said, do you have a children's story? I said, well, it's part of my sermon. So I'm doing a balloon as I preach, so I hope that's okay. For those that know me, I do love twisting balloons, and today is going to tell a story as I go through. So I'm going to take out this silver balloon. These are just plain balloons. They will go pop sometimes. That's what I call what I do balloon kaboom. But hopefully, if I twist it and shape it, it's going to turn into something beautiful. You know, life does take some twists and turns, and I'm sure you guys have been through that, talking about the bear hunt and what you've got to go through it. But life does take some twists and turns. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we know who holds our hand. We know who is there to guide us through the twists and turns. And I'm thankful we have a God who never, ever, ever gives up on us, despite the twists and turns that life gives us. I'm going to create some 90-degree angles with some pinch twists as I twist and shape this balloon. I'm going to join this one in. And pinch it. And 2 more balloons. Bubbles in the middle. And there it is. It's a work in progress. You know, we're all works in progress as God twists and shapes us into his amazing creation. I'm so glad that God never, ever, ever gives up on us. No matter what happens in our life, sometimes it even goes pop. You have those days or just me? The day when you go to the wrong side of bed and things just seem to go wrong. Those that know me, I love destroying cars. In fact, Justin Lawman used to say, if you want to get rid of a car, just give it to Darren, he'll sort it out for you. I've drowned a few. I've had a hailstorm take a car out. Kangaroos seem to be magnets to my car, and I've hit a few and had a few cars rebuilt. But I'm thankful, even on those days when the car goes pop, that I continue to be able to tell God's story as I travel across this conference. And I love travelling and I love telling God's story. A story, even in the Bible, when you read the Bible, that takes some twists and turns. I'm so glad God's given us a Bible full of imperfect people and their stories of what to do and what not to do, rather than just perfect people. There's no such thing in the Bible as perfect people. Just some authentic people who trust God, who make mistakes and are forgiven, and model the kingdom values of mercy and justice and forgiveness and righteousness and grace. And that's what God is calling us to be today. And there it is. It's part of a bigger picture. It's part of a bigger story. And sometimes we can only see part of a picture. And sometimes we ask the question, why? Why does this happen and why does that happen? Why does Port have no pastor right now? And I'm glad that God knows a bigger picture. He knows the full story, and he holds us in the palm of his hand. It reminds me of a story that came from a desk recently, written by, of all people, my sister-in-law. We put this picture up, we have it down the back there. My sister-in-law is a very talented writer, and lately she's been writing this series, which is a series that tells the Australian story of how the Adventist Church in Australia came to be. And I had seen this car before I realised it was part of our Australian story. Let me tell you that story. The year was 1925, and the call went out for some people, coal porters if you like, to take God's message to the farms all the way from Perth to Darwin. Quite a feat back then. No sealed roads, no garages, no NRMA, no spots where you can just stop and get petrol. But Neville Westwood had just purchased a car, and he named it Bubsy, a Citroen 5CV. And he decided he was going to take this on. He and his mate there standing up there, Davies, two young men, up for an adventure. They were going to do this. So in 1925, they loaded their little boot in that car, and the car's only a two-seater. And you can see both these men are quite tall, so it was quite a feat just to get in the car, let alone to drive the car. And remember, this car is not built for Australian, well, there's no roads, not built for the Australian bush. So they just set their compass towards Darwin and set off through the dusty tracks to take God's message to the farms as they went. I asked my sister-in-law and brother what they had in the trunk of that car. They're not quite sure, but they gave me some clues of some of the little leaflets and tracts that they may have had back then that they were taking around door to door in 1925. But they loaded up their boot and they were going to take these tracts and tell God's story as they went. Well, the story is told it wasn't easy. It took some twists and turns. In fact, the biggest issue, according to these two guys, was the tyres. Because the tyres weren't made for the Australian desert, the sand and the rocks and the stumps and things, and punctures were quite regular on this car. They had to actually take the repair kit, and when that ran out, they just grabbed what they could. Sometimes they stuffed the tyres with grass, Spinifex grass. There's even a rumour, not sure if it's true, that snake skin was used at one time just to keep that show on the road and keep those tyres going through the bush. But Westwood and Davies had a faith, I'm sure, was built on a solid foundation. So for them, it was to make it to Darwin, one way or another. I said earlier, there was no NRMA, there were no real mechanics they could call. They just had to make it to the next farm. Sometimes that meant walking a distance just to get to the farm, to get what they needed to keep the show on the road. And there it is, built on a solid foundation. You know, we're on a journey too. We are on a journey to the shores of the promised land. Reminds people of Israel. They were on a journey to the shores of the promised land, their promised land. And God was taking them out of a land of slavery to a land of milk and honey and freedom. You have your Bibles. We find that Moses is worried about that journey in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 4 to 12. And here we find the people who actually have come through the desert. They're on the shores of the promised land. The people of Israel are about to go in. Moses is not. And Moses is worried. He's worried if God will continue to be a part of their family as they're going to the land of milk and honey. He's worried if they will keep God at the centre. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses is literally, it's like his last will and testament. It's a repetition of the law. He's saying these things are important. He's repeating the law to the people of Israel. And it says in chapter 6 and verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts." Moses knew. You can't take your family on a journey unless you're on that journey yourself. You can't take your family to the foot of the cross to experience the love and the grace and the salvation and forgiveness you find there unless you've experienced that yourself. Our children are more likely, according to research, when it all boils down, there's been study after study done on this, when it all boils down, everything's taken into account, children are more likely to adopt the faith of their parents. Now that's the good news. It's also the scary news. I remember as a dad when my kids were born, and this is now a few years ago, my son Andrew and my daughter Madison, and I remember looking at them and saying, well, the stats tell me that I'm going to lose one of those from the church. Not just from the church, but from the faith. One of those is going to wander away. And I remember asking myself the question as I held those two young children in my arms, which one? Which one? And I was a rather selfish dad because I don't want to lose either of them. If I get to heaven and my family's not there, then I'll see my ministry as a failure. My first ministry is to my home. And so I guess I read the research, I read the scriptures, and I'm pretty selfish in that I want to turn the odds in my favour. Now, I know that there are no guarantees. When you read the Bible, even the first family got things wrong. And God, in his wisdom, made our children with free will. And so even my best parenting doesn't give me any guarantees. And for those of our children who have wandered away, we need to remember that God's story of redemption and grace and reconciliation and forgiveness isn't over yet. He still wants to tell his story. And the research I read about keeping our kids, also the same research says that for those kids that have wandered away, if they have praying parents, those kids are more likely to come back. If they have parents who are non-judgmental and show unconditional love, those kids are more likely to come back. If those parents model what a good Christian life looks like and continues to model that, those kids are more likely to come back. That's what the research is saying. So I weep at the altar for our children who wandered away. If we could but close our back doors and open our front doors, our churches will be full and overflowing. Now, I know we've got to take the gospel to every kindred, to every tongue, to every people, but it starts with my home. It starts with my family. It starts with my relatives. The journey takes some twists and turns. Sometimes it even goes pop. I said earlier, God isn't calling for perfect families. He's calling for authentic families. There's a huge difference. You know, Westwood and Davies, they finally made it to Darwin. Job complete. You'd think so for these two boys. Turn around and go home, but not these young lads. They said, we've made it this far. We might as well just keep going and see where we end up. And so they got some more literature sent to some towns along the way, and next slide shows they just kept on driving in their Citroen 5CV, no sealed roads, through deserts and rivers and mountains and whatever came at them. They kept this 5CV going. The story is told at one stage they were driving along and a rock or something hit and put a hole in the fuel tank. So what did Neville Westwood do? Back then you couldn't just stop at the next petrol station. No, you had to preserve your fuel. That kept you going. And so the story is told that he put his finger into the hole in the fuel tank, ducked down underneath the dash and was doing that, and he held the steering wheel while Davies told him what rocks and trees were coming up. And he kept on steering, just to keep the show on the road, to get to the next farm. Often he'll stay at the farm and ask to borrow the blacksmith shop while he fashioned and made and whatever part was needed. He would put it together so that he could keep going and get to the next farm. Kept this show going right around Australia. In fact, the good Australian ethic of tying it up with wire just to keep the show on the road probably comes from this story. The story of resilience, perseverance, not giving up. A bit of an adventure, a bit of a journey with God. When we read on here we find that Moses says to the people of Israel, these commandments I give you today are to be on your heart. Then it says, impress them on your children. That word for impress means continuous. It talks about the idea of, the word means often inscribing into stone. I don't know if you ever tried to inscribe into stone. Sometimes when it comes to impressing things on my kids, it's a bit like trying to inscribe into stone. It doesn't seem to get through. Seems like it can be a dripping, annoying tap sometimes, and you wonder if it's getting through. And this word for impress says, don't give up, parents. Your job as a parent is never done. And in case you're thinking right now, Pastor Darren, you're preaching a family sermon, a parenting sermon, and I'm a grandparent. I've got a few grey hairs too right now coming through. I think I qualify now for grey nomads. Just got to get a caravan and I'll be right. In case you're thinking you're not talking to me, well, hang on. Notice it says, "Hear, O Israel." It doesn't say, "Hear, O parents." Moses is speaking to the entire assembled congregation. And the old saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," speaks here. But vice versa. It takes a child to raise a village, speaks as well. There's so much research recently I've been reading about intergenerational worship together, when we all gather together, mum, dad, grandma, grandpa, in-laws, outlaws, kids, singles, whoever. When the congregation gathers together and rubs shoulders together, I could tell you so much about the benefits it gives, not just to the children, but to the adults. Being together grows us all up spiritually, what the research is saying. In fact, my friends in the other denominations who I spend some time with look at us Adventists and say, "We want what you have." See, so many of them do what they call Sunday school, and they do it at the same time as the adults are meeting. In fact, in some churches, you come together in the car park. That's the last time the family sees each other, because you go your various ways and don't meet till the service is over. And in my Sunday keeping friends' churches, they've not just lost one generation, they've lost generation after generation of children who grow up in the church, who go to Sunday school, who go to youth group, then graduate from their faith because they never belonged. Yes, having our kids with us, sometimes our children make noise, but let me tell you, if I don't hear a baby crying, I know the church is dying. I'd rather hear a baby screaming and have the mic turned up than not have one there. A child in our midst, a crying child in our midst, is a sign that the kingdom of heaven is very near. I can speak over any screaming child. I've never had one yet that's outdone me. A few have tried. But no screaming child's outdone me yet. We read on. It says, talk about them when you sit at home. There's 4 different times given here. Talk about them when you sit at home. 4 wheels that drive this journey forward. When you sit at home. The power of the family meal. And boy, there is so much research around the power of the family meal. Google it. If families would do 3 or 4 meals, now that's not that many during the week, but 3 or 4 meals together where we actually dust off that relic called the dining room table and actually sit down together around the dining room table and have a meal, those children are more likely to do better at school. I'll take that as a dad. I can do that. If we sit down around a family meal, those kids are less likely to get involved in at-risk activities. I'll take that as a dad. If we do regular family meals, then childhood issues that are now regular, like depression and anxiety, reduce. Not sure exactly what that is yet, but I think I might know. Research still trying to get to the bottom of that one. And those children are more likely to adopt the faith of their parents. When you sit at home, often we live in a busy society where we don't find the time to sit and just eat a slow meal together. The secret's not in the food. I can bake an egg or cook an egg. I can do my famous lasagna. It's not in the meal. It's in the slow eating around that dining room table together, 3 or 4 times a week. When you sit at home, let's find another wheel in here. When you sit at home, when you walk along the road, or drive time. I love drive time. I do a lot of Ks in my car. 60,000 kilometres a year is about what I average. And time for me to talk to God. If I can keep that mobile phone turned off, and often I'm with Vodafone, I'm out of range anyway. Vodafone is getting worse. I just told my son this morning on the way up and said, this Vodafone on this highway is getting worse, not better. May need to go to 5G or something. But anyway, time, downtime, when you walk, when you drive along the road. And often, I have the privilege right now of running my daughter down to Sydney on a regular basis. She's studying nursing at the SAN. She tries to get home because she has a cat. Doesn't come home and see us, she comes home and see the ragdoll cat. And so I've got a lot of time I could put on the train, but I think, well, Dad, she's going to be gone soon. She's 21. So I need to have those last few moments to drip feed the things I want to drip feed into her. So I quite willingly hop in the car early in the morning to drive her down to the SAN so she's ready for her uni classes down there. As we drive, we drive. We talk. Often from her it's just grunts or one-word syllables, but somewhere along the journey she begins to talk. I hear about her loves and her losses and her fears and her anxieties and her worries and her cares, and she asks the hard spiritual questions, some that even really stump me. But I don't need to know the answers. I just need to wrestle with the answers. Wrestle with the questions. Kids need parents who are prepared to engage in the conversation, not have all the answers. She'll work it out. I'm just drip feeding into her. My job as a dad is never done, and it seems, especially when it comes to our daughters, for some reason, daughters are able to twist their dads around their finger, I'm told. Something about daughters. But I'm glad I have the opportunity to speak into her heart. When you walk along the road, never give up on fighting for the right relationship with your children. Never give up. Children need nosy parents who know where their kids are at. And that takes time. In fact, children spell love as Time. And time is probably the greatest resource that is the scarcest in society we find ourselves in today. But if we will take the time to invest now, it pays dividends down the track. When you walk along the road, when you lie down, the twilight zone or story time. Stories give our children the weapons they need to defeat the dragons. And the dragons are real out there. Want to bring our kids down. The enemy has plans for our children. The question is, do we? But if we could but take the time, especially in the younger years, to read our children a story. Stories actually help our children with their values. Once again, children who read are less likely to be depressed, according to research. And recent brain research found that the storyteller brain and the child's brain actually sync. The same areas light up when a story is being told. And I say it's almost like the child is in that story experiencing the story once again. They need to hear the story of the Bible, God's stories. The Bible's written in stories. It's not a set of doctrines, it's a set of stories first. The doctrines are in the stories. But the Bible is God's story to us. They need to hear stories of the church universal. Great acts of God through history, through his church. They need to hear the stories of the church denominational. Why does the Adventist church exist? That's why I'm so glad that this series is coming out as my talented sister-in-law writes those books one by one. Hearing our denominational story. Need to hear the story of the church local. Why does Port Macquarie Church exist? Why do we shift from in town to here? And who formed this church? And who are the matriarchs and patriarchs over the years of this church? And what has God done through this church? Stories of the church local. But most of all, your story. Why are you a Christian? Why are you an Adventist Christian? And grandparents, you have a role to play right here. In fact, when grandchildren were asked to describe their grandparents in research, they said they described them as being a bit like God. Grandparents have a spiritual role to play in their grandchildren. So tell your story. If you can't tell it, write it down. But make sure your kids, your grandkids, and your great-grandkids know your story, what God has done, why you are a Christian, and where God has come through in your life. When you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Morning worship or evening worship, but somewhere where we bring the family together around the family altar and spend some time in God's Word. Doesn't need to be long, and please don't make it boring. Short, simple, to the point, somewhere where you call your family together. There's research done around the power of calling the family around the family altar, known as the first church. The first church. But only 30% of Adventist families have any form of family worship. That's why I put together a resource called Worship in a Box, which is available at the office, as a way of showing families, step by step, how to do a family worship and call their family together around the family altar. Powerful. A powerful wheel in driving the family journey forward. Then it says, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. God doesn't want our time. He wants our stuff as well. He wants our possessions. He wants our Googling time. He wants our coffee table time. He wants our hobby time. He wants all our time. He wants our 24/7 living. See, here is the thing. Children don't adopt necessarily the seventh-day faith, even though the seventh-day faith is important. They're more likely to adopt the 24/7 faith. The faith that no one else sees, but they do. In my marriage with my wife Lisa, when no one else is watching, but my kids are. In those times when I've had a really tough day in ministry, I just feel like throwing it all in, going back to Mildura and picking grapes. I loved picking grapes. Hard work, but a lot of fun. And when I feel like quitting, how does God work for me then, in my down times, in my hard times, in my times of anger, righteous anger? How does God work for me then? That's what my kids need to see. They don't need to see a perfect Darren. They need to see an authentic Darren who makes mistakes and says he's sorry even to my kids and my wife and models the kingdom values to my children. You see, research tells us we only have a short window in time. I'm going to attach this windscreen onto this thing I'm making. A short window in time to impress these things on our kids. Yes, our job's never done, but research talks about the 4 to 14 window. If I can invest in doing these things during the 4 to 14 window, that's ages 4 to 14, then the outcomes are likely to be better for me. You can Google 4 to 14 window, find so much about it, investing in that age group. Now, I know the Holy Spirit can convict and work in everyone's life at any time, and He does that. But research says that our evangelism, our discipleship begins at home in the 4 to 14 window. You know, Westwood and Davies continued the journey right around Australia, and they finally, there they are, middle of the desert. Look at the size of the thing. Look at how tall they are. Imagine driving around Australia squeezed into that. But that's what they did. In the car they called affectionately Bubsy. They never gave up. And finally, in the next photo, they're coming through rivers and getting the locals to help pull them out. They get bogs. They couldn't get all the RMA. Got the locals to come and pull them out just to keep the show on the road. And eventually, as they nosy their way around Australia, they make it back to Western Australia. This time, people have heard, and they're there to cheer Bubsy and Westwood and Davies home. They just become the very first car to circumnavigate Australia. And if you Google Bubsy or the Westwood story or the first car around Australia, you'll read this story. Or better still, buy the book from Better Books and Food. You help the union, help Amanda to stay in her job, my sister-in-law. But yeah, it tells a story. You can read it to your kids. And if you go to the National Museum in Canberra, you see Bubsy there today, done up. And it tells a story of what God did through these two men. I know God wants to tell a story through our family and through our church as well. Why? Because the book of Malachi tells us why. We'll finish there today. The last few words in the Old Testament. If you go to Matthew and work your way back, you'll find this unique little book of Malachi. And look at the last few words. Malachi chapter 4 and verse 4. And it says, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all of Israel." If you're a good biblical reader, your mind goes straight back to Deuteronomy. and Exodus, the law, and the repetition of the law. And that Shema passage I just quoted, which all good Jewish citizens say regularly. In fact, it's probably the very first memory gem that Jesus learnt at his mother's knee. Then it says, "See, I will send you the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." Full stop. And often we as a church stop there. And our preachers preach a good message about the Elijah message. The last great message goes out before Jesus comes again. Do you believe that? I do. I believe that we as a church have been raised up with the birth notice of taking a message of hope to a world of hopelessness, and boy, they need it now more than ever before. World conditions point to the fact that Jesus is coming soon. Prophecy. Oh boy, even in my few short years, 53 years of life, I remember the prophecies preached when I was a kid in Mildura Church. And some of those now you got to get a stamp and press fulfilled, 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 fulfilled on them. Yes, Jesus is coming soon. And the Elijah message has to go out now like never before. And we as a church have that as our birth notice. We exist for that. If we don't do that, we might as well pack up and go join the other churches. We exist for mission. We exist for taking this message in the context of those three angels to a dying world. That's our mandate. That's why I stand here as a pastor today. That's why I embrace ministry, because I want to be part of that workforce. I want to be part of that mission. I want to be part of telling the world that Jesus is coming soon. But we pause there and we preach a sermon and we don't finish the passage. It says, "He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction." Full stop. End of the Old Testament. Whatever the Elijah message is, and we know what it is, whatever the Elijah message does, and we know what it does, it starts at home. It starts with my heart turned towards my wife, and vice versa. It starts with my heart's turned towards my children and not giving up on fighting for the right relationship with them, not giving up on impressing upon them like drip feeding. And the hearts of the children turn to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. Boy, is the enemy having a field day when it comes to family, even the definition of family. When it comes to our children, I'll spend another hour talking about what electronics does to the teen brain. I left the booklets out there near the door, brand new booklet on the teen brain, which talks about what's going on with addiction. Brand new in the recognition of addictions is technology or screen addiction and what it does to the teen brain. Anyway, I'm not going to preach that today. That's another sermon. Or read it. Grab a booklet and read it. But God today, I believe, is calling on Port Macquarie to be the church that raises up a generation like never before, who can seize our destiny, their destiny, who can seize our mission, God's mission, who can rise up and be Daniels and Esthers and little maids and Josephs and stand and not be turned and preach that message. Because I don't know about you, I want to go home. I want to go home. Let's be that church. Let's preach that message. Let's raise that generation. And when Jesus comes very soon, he'll say, well done, Port Macquarie. Come inherit the home prepared for you. And I say, even so come, Lord Jesus.